332 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean coast, Phoenicia. Picture this. You're standing on an island, not a large island, half a mile wide, maybe less, a mile long. The waters around you run deep, the currents unpredictable, the seawalls rising directly from the rock face on the western side, where the Mediterranean opens into nothing but open water. You have been here your entire life. Your fathers were here before you. And for as long as anyone in your city can remember, Tyre has never fallen. Not to the Assyrians who tried, not to the Babylonians who spent 13 years outside your walls and eventually gave up and went home. The sea is your protection, your identity, your reason for existing. You are the greatest maritime trading city in the ancient world. You build the ships that carry the commerce of civilizations. Your purple dye colors the robes of kings across 3 continents. Your sailors know every coastline from the Aegean to the Atlantic. And right now, standing on the mainland shore half a mile away, staring at your walls across open water, is Alexander the Great. He has no fleet. He has no siege experience that has prepared him for anything like this. He has never tried to take an island city before. He is 23 years old, and he has never lost a battle, and he is about to attempt something that every military mind of his age would tell him is impossible. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what Alexander did at Tyre, why it took 7 months of some of the most brutal and innovative siege warfare the ancient world ever saw, how close he came to failing, and why the fall of Tyre changed the eastern Mediterranean forever. To understand why Alexander needed Tyre, you need to understand the strategic situation he was in after the Granicus and Issus. By the winter of 333 BCE, Alexander had already accomplished things that seemed impossible to the world watching him. He had crossed into Asia and broken the Persian defensive force at the Granicus River in the spring of 334. He had spent the following year sweeping south along the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, liberating Greek cities from Persian control, eliminating Persian naval bases one by one, and establishing his army's logistical foundation in territory that was now securely his. Then, in the autumn of 333 BCE, he had faced Darius III himself at the Battle of Issus and done something that the Persian world had not believed was possible. He had broken the King of Kings in open battle and sent him fleeing eastward, leaving behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, and the entire Persian royal treasury that had been traveling with the army. Issus was a shattering victory, but it was not the end of the war. Darius was still alive. His empire was battered but functioning. He still commanded enormous resources, vast territories, and the loyalty of provinces that Alexander had not yet reached. And critically, Persia still controlled the sea. This was the problem that Alexander understood more clearly than almost anyone around him, and it shaped every decision he made in the months following Issus. The Persian navy, built primarily from the ships and sailors of the Phoenician city-states along the eastern Mediterranean coast, was the most powerful maritime force in the ancient world. Tyre was its heart. Sidon, Byblos, and the other Phoenician cities contributed ships and sailors, but Tyre was where the wealth and the shipbuilding expertise and the deepest naval tradition lived. As long as Persia controlled Tyre, it controlled the sea lanes. As long as it controlled the sea lanes, it could threaten Alexander's supply lines from Greece and Macedonia. Land forces behind him on coastlines he had already passed, and potentially destabilize everything he had built west of the Euphrates. Alexander could not march east toward the Persian heartland with that threat operating behind him. He needed the eastern Mediterranean coast. He needed its ports. He needed its ships, or at least he needed to ensure that those ships could not be used against him. After Issus, most of the Phoenician cities along the coast submitted quickly. Marathus, Byblos, Sidon. They opened their gates, offered their submission, and handed over their Persian-aligned administrations. The process was fast and relatively painless. The political calculation was straightforward. Darius had just lost at Issus. Alexander was coming. The sensible thing to do was be on the right side before the choice was taken away. Then Alexander reached Tyre. The Tyrian leadership received him with a careful diplomatic courtesy that threaded a very specific needle. They acknowledged Alexander. They sent him gifts. They expressed something that sounded like respect without quite being submission. And then they made their position clear. Tyre would remain neutral in the conflict between Alexander and Darius. Neither side would be admitted to the city. Neither side would be allowed to use Tyrian ships or Tyrian harbors to prosecute the war against the other. Alexander asked to enter the city to make a sacrifice at the famous temple of Melkart, the Phoenician deity that the Greeks identified with Heracles. For Alexander, who traced his personal lineage to Heracles and had wrapped his entire campaign in the mythology of Greek heroic tradition, this was not a trivial religious request. It was a statement of identity and legitimacy. The Tyrians refused. The temple on the island was sacred ground. Only Tyrian kings had ever made sacrifice there. If Alexander wished to honor Melkart, there was an older temple of the god on the mainland, at a place called Old Tyre. He was welcome to use that. It was a polite refusal. It was also a direct challenge, and Alexander recognized it as both. He understood what neutrality in this context actually meant. Tyre was the linchpin of Persian naval power. Its shipyards built the warships. Its sailors crewed them. Its harbors sheltered them. A neutral Tyre was not a neutral strategic factor. It was a deferred problem, a sword left sheathed for now that could be drawn the moment the strategic balance shifted in Darius's favor. If Alexander marched east and Darius regrouped and the war tilted back toward Persia, Tyre would not remain neutral. Tyre would return to being what it had always been, the greatest naval base in the eastern Mediterranean, operating in Persian interests. Alexander could not accept that risk. He laid siege to Tyre. The decision was militarily rational and operationally terrifying, because Tyre was not a mainland city with walls that siege towers and battering rams could reach. It sat half a mile offshore, surrounded by deep water, protected by walls that rose in places to a height of 150 feet directly from the sea. Its harbors, one opening to the north and one to the south, were defended by chains and booms that prevented hostile ships from entering. Its population was experienced, motivated, and backed by a maritime tradition that gave it resources and capabilities that no land army could simply overwhelm. Alexander had no navy. His Macedonian army was a land force. The warships that he had brought from the Greek states at the beginning of the campaign had been dismissed months earlier, partly to save money, and partly because Alexander had made the calculated decision to defeat the Persian navy by capturing its ports, rather than fighting it at sea. Not metaphorically, literally. Alexander decided to construct a causeway from the mainland to the island, a mole of earth and timber and stone extending half a mile across the seafloor to the base of the Tyrian walls. It was an engineering project on a scale that had no real precedent in the ancient world, conceived by a 23-year-old king who had never formally studied military engineering and executed by an army that had never built anything remotely like it. The work began immediately. The mainland coast opposite Tyre had the ruins of old Tyre to draw building material from, and the seafloor close to the mainland shore was relatively shallow. In the early stages, the work went quickly. Timber was cut from the forests of Lebanon in the mountains above the coast. Stone was dragged from the ruins and dumped into the water. Earth was piled on top. A road began to grow from the mainland toward the island, 200 feet wide and built wide enough for multiple siege towers to advance side by side along its surface. The Tyrians watched from their walls and made jokes. Then the water got deeper, and the jokes stopped. As the causeway extended further from shore, the seafloor dropped and the work became exponentially harder. Material that had held firm in shallow water began shifting in deeper current. The labor required to move stone and timber far enough out to matter increased with every foot of progress. The men working at the leading edge of the causeway were now within range of Tyrian archers and naval vessels that could row out from the protected harbors and fire into the workers. Alexander responded with engineering. He built 2 massive siege towers at the far end of the causeway, the tallest the Macedonian army had ever constructed, and armed them with artillery, catapults, and bolt throwers that could suppress Tyrian fire and give the workers some protection as they continued their work. The towers rose above the end of the causeway, moving forward as the mole extended, pushing the defensive perimeter further and further toward the island. The Tyrians responded with fire. They took a large cargo vessel, filled its hull with dried timber, pitch, sulfur, and every combustible material their engineers could gather, loaded the prow with cauldrons of oil and incendiary material, suspended so that they would tip forward and pour burning liquid onto whatever the ship hit, and then packed the stern with extra weight so that when the ship was driven forward, the prow rose up and the full force of the burning material cascaded forward and down. They sent this vessel in under sail on a favorable wind, aimed directly at the siege towers at the end of the causeway. The fire ship hit exactly where they intended it to. Both towers caught, the artillery platforms burned. The timber framework of the causeway end caught, and the whole leading section of the mole began to go up. Tyrian soldiers and sailors who had been waiting in small boats rushed in under the cover of the fire and smoke to pull down as much of the damaged structure as they could and destroy any artillery pieces that survived the blaze. Alexander lost weeks of work in a single afternoon. He did not stop. He ordered the causeway rebuilt wider than before, wide enough that the towers would have more stable footing and the work would be harder to destroy. He ordered new towers built. He went personally into the forests of Lebanon to supervise the cutting of new timber and to encourage the work crews with the kind of direct personal presence that his army always responded to. Whatever Alexander told his men in those forests about what they were going to do and why, the work accelerated. But he had also understood something fundamental by this point. He could not take Tyre without a navy. The causeway was essential, but it was not sufficient. The Tyrians could harry the workers from the sea indefinitely. They could threaten the flanks of the mole with warships that the Macedonian army had no way to answer. To complete the siege, Alexander needed to control the water around the island as well as the land approach. So he went and got a fleet. The kings of Cyprus, watching the strategic situation in the eastern Mediterranean crystallize around Alexander's obvious momentum, made the calculation that the Phoenician city-states had made after Issus. They sent their ships to Alexander. 120 warships arrived from Cyprus. Additional vessels came from the Phoenician cities that had already submitted, including Sidon, whose contribution was particularly useful given that Sidonian sailors understood Tyrian naval capabilities better than anyone. Alexander assembled a fleet of more than 200 ships. The strategic situation around Tyre transformed overnight. The Tyrians had perhaps 80 warships available. They had been fighting off a land-based siege for months by this point, and their city, while still holding, was under continuous pressure from the growing causeway and the artillery that was beginning to reach their walls. Now they looked out at a Macedonian fleet that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1 and included the finest warships from Cyprus and Phoenicia. They made one attempt to fight the Macedonian fleet in open water. Their warships came out through the northern harbor entrance and engaged the Macedonian vessels in a battle that was brief and decisive. The Tyrian navy was pushed back into its harbors and the harbor chains were closed. From that point forward, Tyrian naval power was contained within its own ports, unable to operate freely, no longer able to threaten the causeway workers or the flanks of the mole. Alexander moved his fleet to blockade both harbor entrances. He placed Cypriot ships opposite the northern harbor and Phoenician ships opposite the southern, with orders to prevent any Tyrian vessel from breaking out. He armed additional ships with artillery platforms and assault equipment and began probing the sea walls from the water, looking for weaknesses, testing the Tyrian defenses at points the defenders could not simultaneously cover from land and sea. The pressure on the city was now total. The causeway was advancing again. The fleet controlled the surrounding water. Artillery was beginning to reach the walls from both the mole and the sea. The Tyrians, who had spent the early months of the siege watching from a position of confidence and making sorties that damaged Macedonian equipment and delayed Macedonian progress, were now fighting on every front simultaneously with no prospect of relief from outside. Darius sent no navy. He sent diplomats instead. His offers to Alexander grew more extraordinary as the siege progressed. He offered money, territory, his daughter in marriage, and eventually a peace settlement that would have given Alexander everything west of the Euphrates as his recognized domain. One of Alexander's senior officers, Parmenion, reportedly said that if he were Alexander, he would accept those terms. Alexander replied that if he were Parmenion, he would too. He rejected every offer. The Tyrians sent their own desperate message outward, evacuating women, children, and elderly citizens to Carthage, the great Tyrian colony on the North African coast, for safekeeping. Carthage sent expressions of solidarity and regret, but no ships, no army, no relief. Tyre faced what was coming alone. By late summer, the causeway had reached the island walls. The full weight of the Macedonian siege train, the towers and the rams and the artillery, was now in contact with the defensive structure that had protected Tyre through every previous threat in its history. Alexander's naval vessels attacked the seawall simultaneously, with battering rams mounted on ships that were held in position against the stone by anchor cables and grappling equipment, while engineers worked to find and widen any crack or weakness in the masonry. The Tyrian defenders responded with ingenuity that deserves full acknowledgement. They dropped massive boulders into the water in front of the seawalls to prevent the ram ships from getting close enough to strike effectively. Alexander's engineers moved the boulders with cranes mounted on ships. The Tyrians sent divers to cut the anchor cables, holding the ships in position. Alexander replaced the anchor ropes with chains. They used red-hot sand heated in metal containers and poured it down onto Macedonian soldiers who had gotten close to the base of the walls, a weapon that penetrated armor and caused burns that were essentially impossible to treat and agonizing beyond description. They hung animal hides and padded material on the walls to absorb the impact of artillery. They built rotating wheels designed to deflect or destroy incoming projectiles before they could strike the wall surface. Everything they tried bought time. Nothing they tried was enough. In late July or early August of 332 BCE, 7 months after Alexander first appeared on the mainland shore, Macedonian battering rams found a section of the southern wall that the constant assault had weakened sufficiently. A breach opened. Alexander moved immediately. Assault bridges were dropped from ships against the broken section of wall. The first men across were killed. Then more came. The companions, the elite Macedonian infantry of the Hypaspists, pushed across the bridge and into the city. Alexander himself crossed with them. The fighting inside Tyre was the kind that ancient accounts describe in terms that make it clear the writers found it difficult to put into measured language. The Tyrians had spent 7 months under siege. They had watched the causeway grow toward them foot by foot. They had fought at every stage with every resource, with the knowledge that Alexander's campaign had no tradition of generous treatment for cities that made him pay this kind of price. They were not going to surrender now. They fought in the streets, from rooftops, from doorways. The Macedonian army was better armed, better trained, and had spent 7 months building a fury of its own. The battle inside the city was short and catastrophic for Tyre. Those Tyrian soldiers who could not escape died where they stood. The Macedonian fleet had sealed the harbors, but a small number of Tyrian ships managed to break through the Sidonian blockade in the final chaos and carry some survivors away. When it was over, approximately 6,000 Tyrian soldiers had been killed in the final battle. Around 2,000 Tyrian men of military age were crucified along the beach on the mainland shore, a display of consequences that Alexander designed to be visible to every city along the eastern Mediterranean coast that might be weighing the cost of resistance. Approximately 30,000 Tyrian civilians, the women and children and non-combatants who had not been evacuated to Carthage, were sold into slavery. Alexander entered the Temple of Melkart and made his sacrifice. The fall of Tyre echoed across the ancient world in ways that went far beyond the immediate military and strategic consequences. Egypt submitted without a fight when Alexander marched south from Tyre, partly because the Egyptian population had reasons of their own for preferring almost anyone to the Persians, but partly because the news from Tyre had made the calculation very clear. The same logic applied along the Levantine coast. Gaza held out for 2 months, encouraged in part by a Nabatean commander named Boulders, who believed his fortifications could withstand what Tyre could not. They could not. Gaza fell, and its garrison paid the same price. By the time Alexander entered Egypt in the winter of 332 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean coast was his. The Persian naval threat that had shaped his entire strategic approach since before the campaign began had been eliminated not by fighting the Persian fleet at sea, which he had deliberately avoided, but by capturing every harbor it depended on. The sea lanes were open. His supply lines from Greece and Macedonia were no longer vulnerable. The Phoenician cities that had built the Persian navy were now in his hands or destroyed. And perhaps most importantly for what came next, Alexander's army had learned something about itself at Tyre that no cavalry charge or open battle could have taught it. It had spent 7 months building something unprecedented, solving engineering problems that had no established solutions, sustaining the kind of grinding effort that victory in an afternoon at the Granicus, or even a long afternoon at Gaugamela, simply did not require. The army that emerged from the siege of Tyre was not just the finest fighting force in the ancient world. It was an army that had discovered it could do things that fighting forces were not supposed to be able to do. Alexander had come to the mainland shore opposite an island city with no fleet, no siege expertise equal to the task, and no precedent to follow. He had built a road across the sea. He had assembled a navy from the kingdoms that surrendered to him along the way. He had maintained the siege through fire and storms and desperate Tyrian ingenuity for 7 months without losing the confidence of his army or the momentum of his campaign. When the walls finally broke, it was not because Tyre ran out of courage. It was because Alexander refused to stop. The causeway he built still exists. 2,300 years of sediment have widened it into a permanent land bridge, and the place that was once an island is now a peninsula, reshaped by the engineering of a siege that everyone said was impossible. The land Alexander made is still there. He always left something behind.